Class presentation for Transcendent on Monday, October 5. We're talking about this week about the Black Christian experience and faith in America through its history and into our own time. I have often offered this afterwards, after we talked about white faith, decided this time to switch it around to talk about black faith and then put that next to Anglo-Saxon or white supremacy faith. You can help me see how this works out. Understanding the black faith in America cannot be separated from its history. And its history begins with colonialism, the fact that Europeans came to America and colonized America. That is to say, it captured the land and took it over from the indigenous people who were here. It extracted the natural resources, both minerals and the fact that there's vast areas of land that could be converted to agriculture. And they exploited the people who were here. They basically decimated and moved out all of the Native Americans who were here, and then they had to deal with the economic realities of how are we going to work all this land. That's the colonial connection. There were three groups of Europeans who colonialized North America. We hear almost exclusively about the English colonials in American history and what's written in the textbooks and what you may have been taught in school. And it was the Puritans and the Pilgrims who came, who were the early people that we remember in our American history. There were also Spanish colonials who came and settled great chunks of Florida and Georgia along the Gulf Coast, and then, of course, into Mexico and large chunks of New Mexico and California as well. The French also colonialized America, a lot of northern parts of America and Canada, and there were wars fought between the English and the French and the Spanish from time to time to see who got to control the resources of that land. Now, the reading for this week from Douglas's book, Stand Your Ground, the fourth chapter, A Father's Faith. And in the book, of course, is talking about the experience of black folks responding to the killing of Trayvon Martin several years ago, not unlike the killings that we're talking about these days, by white folks who decide they can decide the life or death of an African American person. She's describing Trayvon's father's faith in this chapter, but then it gives her a chance to expand on her notion of what is the basic Christian faith of so many black Americans, and how does that stand them and as able to confront the difficulties of life in America and what gets them through it. And it's and we'll talk about that more on Wednesday. She talks about it in the context of Anglo-Saxon, what she calls Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. The Anglo-Saxons were one particular group of English religious zealots who came to America to establish a Christian empire, a Christian nation, where they were the perfect white people who created the perfect democracy. And it was this ideal that they were indeed the chosen people, and God wanted them to have this beautiful land. The other word for Anglo-Saxon is simply white supremacists, people who believe that white people are, by definition, better than everybody else, particularly persons of color, African, uh, brown-skinned person, yellow-skinned persons, anybody that's anything less than pure pink or white. So we'll talk some more about the beliefs of white supremacists and the Christians who are white supremacists next week. What I want us to begin to talk about is the sense of how chattel slavery in America set up the conditions for the creation of a unique black faith in America. The colonists at first resisted engaging their slaves, their enslaved people, their chattel servants, in religious conversation for fear that that might make them want to resist, might give them some sort of encouragement. God didn't want them to be slaves. About 1740 came a great revival called the Great Awakening, and many of the revivalist preachers of that time decided it was important to be able to evangelize the black folks, the slaves in the fields and in the houses and on the plantations and farms. Did so. At that time, and then there were probably owners before that who taught their people about the essence of Christianity and the God that they believed in. But the great emotional awakening of that revival swept a lot of people into a sense of this Christian religion is something I want to embrace. And so there began a need for groupings of people to gather for worship and support and nurture. At first, they wanted to gather in groupings, but slave owners were that. Some places allowed them to attend worship in the white churches. Of course, they were carefully segregated, either in the balconies or in the back. And after a while, the black folks decided the heck with this. This is my interpretation of the heck with this. We're gonna have our own gatherings, and they finally got it together enough to have their own congregations and their own pastors. They were mainly Baptists and Methodists in those days, partly because, as we understand it, some Baptist preachers and some Methodist preachers were actually against slavery. And so black folks retracted to those particular faiths. And then they created independent Baptist churches and independent Methodist churches, the AME Zion, and Congregational and CME churches that are not in the denominations we have now. Each one of these black groups of denominations created a unique blend of the colonialist beliefs that they were taught by the white preachers and teachers of those days, and their own African beliefs that they had brought with them, that had developed and been nurtured in the soil of America. And it's one of the paradoxes of the history of black faith that it is that's still that interesting mix of the white beliefs, the doctrines of Christianity that they learned and are still very forcefully presented by particularly the evangelical white churches in America today. So the time of creation of churches, they began to really create these congregations, black and Methodists. Eventually, later in the 1900s, 1800s, Pentecostalism caught fire, And that became a separate group of Christians that also, black Christians who were on fire for Christianity. So we have here the context of how black Christianity came into being, the historical context. Now, there are several pieces I want you to do a little research for before we meet again on Wednesday. The first piece is I want you to begin to think about one of the questions I have on the syllabus, and the questions is, to what extent does current black Christianity still have remnants of colonial faith and colonial religion? In that helpful to life as a black person in America today? That's a question that a lot of preachers are now beginning to ask about for themselves and for their congregations. It's not an easy question to ask. I think it's a very good question because the absolute rigidity of colonial Christian, white supremacy Christian in those early days, 1700s, 1800s, it was very doctrinaire, very firm on what the doctrines were and were not, and what you had to believe and not believe if you're going to be a true and faithful Christian. And that became a part of, as I understand the history, and I want you to check that out a little bit and see if you can find anything about that. That became a part of the general practice and belief of the black churches. Now, the illustration of how I think that it probably is still there, and I need your help to help me understand that. The reason I think that's no doubt still there is a slightly different experience, but the first time I visited a Korean Presbyterian church in America, I was in St. Louis on a denominational staff office in that region at that time, and part of my pastoral leadership was including some Korean Presbyterians. So I went to a worship service. I was looking forward to see how are these Koreans going to be worshiping in their own language and perhaps with their own Korean customs. The service was indeed in Korean. However, the order of worship was exactly what I had grown up with as a white Presbyterian. The hymns they sang, all the contents of their hymnal, all in Korean, but it was the same songs that I had grown up in the hymnal of my white Presbyterian church. What was that about? What happened to their Koreanness? They had been evangelized by the missionaries who came from America to Korea in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And they were taught, this is the way you be a Christian. This is how you worship. This is what you believe. This is what your pastor will be preaching and how your pastor will be preaching in your language. But basically, it was a colonial experience of Christianity. That colonial experience was as embedded with white supremacy and colonial assumptions that 18th, 19th, 20th, early 20th century Protestant missionaries were not even aware of. They were simply bringing their understanding of Christianity to these people. And those people accepted them and are still, this was in the 1980s, were still practicing their Christianity like it was the colonial missionaries was taught by them, to them. How much of that is also true for the black church today? That's your first question to start thinking about. Second question I want you to to maybe do some looking up and thinking about. Kelly Brown Douglas talks a great deal about the spirituals, the early folk religious songs of the chattel slaves, and what they meant, and how they were a coded language about freedom and about how you get through how you get through the day, how you get through your life. If you know some spirituals, if you have some that are particularly special to you, check them out and their history and what they really mean. If you don't know some, look one up. She mentions a number of them and quotes them. Look some of those up or see what you can find out about spirituals and get a sense of what is the idea of God and how God interacts with humanity in that spiritual. In fact, the way people sing is usually shapes and guides their ideas of God. So if you want to know what Black faith is about, Douglas is saying, and other scholars is also saying, you got to look at the music. The next thing I want you to look up are the Black leaders that Kelly Brown Douglas mentions in this chapter. These are some really big names that if you probably know about these folks. If you don't, pick one. And the names are people like Ida B. Wells, Howard Thurman, James Baldwin, what's her name, Williamson, and there are several others in there. For example, I have been studying a lot of the author and leader of the 20th century, Howard Thurman, a great Black prophet and mystic. I actually had a chance to study with him in the last year of my seminary. He came here to Louisville Presbyterian Seminary to teach spirituality. He was an amazing theologian and guy. And he taught and wrote a very specific way of approaching the oppression of living in America as what he called the disinherited of America. How do you keep your integrity? How do you maintain your stability and your balance as a human being in relationship to God? How you do that is how you survive and how you create a new movement of resistance in order to live and change America. So look up some of those folks, one of those folks, do a little research, see what you can find out, and see how that helps you understand Black faith in America. So you can help me. I'm still learning and struggling and studying to try to see if I can understand better how the Black faith works today, how it needs to continue to grow and change, how it influences the life of, for example, the resistance that's going on in downtown Louisville and so many other places in Louisville at this point. What is that? What are the ideas of God? What are the ideas of how God interacts with human beings? That's what we're going to talk about some more. We'll pick up Kelly Brown Douglas's chapter 4, A Father's Faith. We'll talk about the spirituals. We'll talk about her connection with the high God of Africa. We'll talk about freedom, the freedom of God, and what that means for the freedom of human beings. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Exodus. The Exodus is an important piece of her sense of the foundation of Black faith in America. And there are two perspectives on the Exodus in her book. and how they play out in the Black faith. Please look for that. I'll welcome your questions and your comments. Otherwise, I will see you Wednesday morning, 9 o'clock for class, those of you who can make that, and I will record it, of course, as usual. Thank you for your attention. It's good to be with you, and I look forward to studying this very important topic with you all. Bye-bye.